Me on. It's great to be back here after a few years away. Look, the advantage of not being at MSNBC anymore is I get to come on shows like this and talk to you all. You should get someone from MSNBC on and ask them why they cancel the shows, because I can't answer that question. I wish I knew. But there we go. The shows were cancelled at the end of November. I quit at the beginning of January because I wanted to have a platform of my own. I couldn't really spend 2024, one of the most important news years of our lives, genocide in Gaza, fascism at the door here in America with elections. Couldn't really spend that being a guest anchor and a political analyst, which is what I was offered at MSNBC while I was staying there. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get my voice back, and that's why I launched my own media company, as you mentioned, called Zeteo, which we've done a soft launch on, and we're going to launch properly next month. But I'm excited about all the opportunities ahead. The opportunity to do more interviews like the one I did with Mark Regev.
So, Mehdi, could you explain Zeteo? First of all, what does it mean? And what is the gap in the U.S. media landscape that you hope to fill? You've been extremely critical of the U.S. media's coverage of Gaza, saying quite correctly that the coverage has not been as consistent or clear as the last time we saw an invasion of this kind, though far less brutal, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, on Zeteo, it's an ancient Greek word going back to Socrates and Plato, which means to seek out, to search, to inquire for the truth. And at a time when we live in a, some would say, post-truth society, or people on the right are attempting to turn it into a post-truth society, I thought that was an important endeavor to embark upon as a journalist, to go back to our roots. In terms of why launch it and the media space, look, there is a gap in the market, first of all, on the left for a company like this one. Not many progressives have pulled off a for-profit, subscription-based business, media business. We see it on the right, I mean, with Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire, Barry Weiss's The Free Press, and even Tucker Carlson has launched his own subscription-based platform since leaving Fox. And on the progressive space, we haven't really done it. Now, of course, there are wonderful shows like Democracy Now!, which are doing important, invaluable journalism on subjects like Gaza, on subjects like the climate. But across the media industry as a whole, sadly in the US, the massive gap is there are not enough I don't know how to put it, bluntly, truth tellers, people who are willing to say, and when I say truth tellers, I don't just mean, truth in a conventional sense of saying what is true and what is false. I'm saying the language in which we talk about what is happening in the world today. Too many of my colleagues in the media, unfortunately, hide behind lazy euphemisms, both sides journalism. The idea that you can't say Donald Trump is racist because you don't know what's in his heart. You can't say the Republican Party is going full fascist, even as they proclaim that they don't believe in democracy as we conventionally understand it. We can't say there's a genocide in Gaza, even though the International Court of Justice says such a thing is plausible. We run away from very blunt terms which help us understand the world. And I want to treat American consumers of news, global consumers of news, it's a global news organization which I'm founding, with some respect. Stop patronizing them. Tell them what is happening in the world in a blunt way.
So Mehdi, talk about this. I mean, in your criticism of the U.S. media's coverage, in particular of Israel's assault on Gaza, I mean, of course, you have condemned what happened, the Hamas attack in Israel on October 7th. You've also situated the attack in a broader historical frame, and you've received criticism for doing that. And in response, you've said, context is not causation, and context is not justification. So could you explain why you think context, history is so important, and the way in which this question is kind of elided in U.S. media coverage, not just of the Gaza crisis, but especially so now?
So I did an interview with Piers Morgan this week, and if you watch Piers Morgan's shows, he always asks his pro-Palestinian guests or anyone criticizing Israel, condemn what happened on October 7th. It's all about October the 7th, and what happened on October 7th was barbarism. It was a tragedy. It was a terror attack. Civilians were killed. War crimes were carried out. Hostages were taken. And we should condemn it. Of course we should, as human beings, if nothing else. But the world did not begin on October the 7th. The idea that the entire conflicts, Israel, Palestine, the occupation, apartheid, can be reduced to October 7th is madness. And not just me saying that. You talk to leading Israeli peace campaigners, even some leading Israeli generals, people like Shlomo Brom, who talk about having to understand the root causes of a people under occupation fighting for freedom. And it's absurd to me that in our media industry, people should try and run away from context. My former colleagues, Ali Velshi and Ayman Mohyeldin, who Amy mentioned in the introduction, they were on air on October the 7th as news was coming in of the attacks, and they provided context because they're two anchors who really understand that part of the world. Ayman Mohyeldin is perhaps the only US anchor who's ever lived in Gaza, and they came under attack online from certain pro-Israel people for providing context. This idea that we should be embarrassed or ashamed or apologetic of journalists for providing context on one of the biggest stories in the world is madness. You cannot understand what is happening in the world unless you and I, unless journalists, broadcasters are explaining to our viewers and our listeners and our readers why things are happening, where forces are coming from, why people are behaving the way they do. I know America is a country of amnesiacs, but we cannot keep acting as if the world just began yesterday.
That's right.
I ask you about a piece in The Intercept. You also used to report for The Intercept. A headline, "An internal meeting, Christiane Amanpour confronts CNN brass about double standards on Israel coverage." It's a really interesting piece. They were confronting the executives, and one issue that came up, says The Intercept repeatedly, is CNN's longtime process for routing almost all coverage relating to Israel and Palestine through the network's Jerusalem bureau. As The Intercept reported in January, the protocol, which has existed for years but was expanded and rebranded as Second Eyes last summer, slows down reporting on Gaza and filters news about the war through journalists in Jerusalem who operate under the shadow of Israel's military censor. And then it quotes Christiane Amanpour, identified in a recording of that meeting. She said, "You've heard from me. You've heard from my, real distress with Second Eyes, changing copy, double standards, and all the rest," Amanpour said. The significance of this and what we see, Mehdi, it was, I'm not talking Fox right now. On MSNBC and on CNN, you rarely see Palestinians interviewed in extended discussions.
So I think there's a few issues there, Amy. Number one, first of all, we should recognize that Christiane Amanpour has done some very excellent coverage of Gaza for CNN in this conflict. She's had some very powerful interviews and very important guests on. So credit to Christiane during this conflict. Number two, I think US media organizations...
I just wanted to say, particularly on CNN International, which is often not seen on CNN Domestic.
Very good point, Amy. Touche. The second one I would say is US media organizations as a whole are engaging in journalistic malpractice by not informing viewers, listeners, readers
and killing them.
Coverage out of Israel and the occupied territories is coming under the shadow of an Israeli military censor. How many Americans understand or even know about the Israeli military censor, about how much information is controlled? We barely understand that Western journalists are kept out of Gaza, or if when they go in, they're embedded with Israeli military forces and limited to what they can say and do. So I think we should talk about that in a country which kind of prides itself on the First Amendment and free speech and free press. We should understand the way in which information comes out of the occupied territories, in particular from Gaza. And the third point I would say is, Palestinian voices not being on American television or in American print is one of the biggest problems when it comes to our coverage of this conflict. When we talk about why the media is structurally biased towards one party in this conflict, the more powerful party, the occupier, we have to remember that this is one of the reasons
why in Germany just before the war.
In our media. This is one of the reasons. If we don't let people speak, that's
German
what leads to dehumanization. That's what leads to we understand it at home when it comes to, for example, black voices. In recent years, media organizations have tried to take steps to improve diversity on air. When it comes to on-air talent, when it comes to on-air guests, when it comes to balancing panels, we get that we need underrepresented communities to be able to speak. But when it comes to foreign conflicts, we still don't seem to have made that calculation. There was a study done a few years ago of op-eds in the New York Times and the Washington Post on the subject of Israel-Palestine from 1970 to, I think it was 2000 and something. And it was like 2% of all op-eds in the Times and 1% in the Post were written by Palestinians, which is a shocking statistic. We deny these people a voice, and then we wonder why people don't sympathize with their plight or aren't marching in the streets. Well, they are marching in the streets, but in bigger numbers. Why America is okay and kind of blind to the fact that we are complicit in the genocide of these people, because we don't hear from these people.
Well, Mehdi, I mean, explain why that's especially relevant in this instance, because journalists have not been permitted access to Gaza, so there's no reporting going on the ground that's being shown here. I mean, dozens and dozens of journalists have signed a letter asking Israel and Egypt to allow journalists access into Gaza. So if you could talk about that, why it's especially important to hear from Palestinian voices here.
Well, for a start, much of the imagery we see on our screens here or on our newspapers are sanitized images. We don't see the full level of the destruction. And when we try and understand, well, why young people? Why is there such a generational gap when it comes to the polling on Gaza, on ceasefire? Why are young people so much more anti-war than their elder peers? Part of the reason is that young people are on TikTok or Instagram and seeing a much less sanitized version of this war, of Israel's bombardment. They are seeing babies being pulled from the rubble, limbs missing. They are seeing hospitals hospitals carrying out procedures without anesthetic. They are seeing just absolute brutality, the kind of stuff that UN humanitarian chiefs are saying we haven't seen in this world for 50 years. And that's the problem, right? If we're sanitizing the coverage, Americans aren't being told, really, aren't being informed, African people, again, missing context on what is happening on the ground. And of course, Israel, by keeping Western journalists out,
the young generation must
makes
stand
it even
up.
easier
They now must
for those images to be blocked. And therefore, you have Palestinian, brave Palestinian journalists on the ground trying to film, trying to document their own genocide, streaming it to our phones. And we've seen over 100 of them killed over the last 5 months. That is not an accident. That is not a coincidence. Israel wants to stamp out independent voices, stamp out any kind of coverage of its own genocidal behavior. And therefore, again, you're able to have a debate in this country where the political debate is completely disconnected to the public debate, and the public debate is completely misinformed. I'm amazed, when you look at the polling, that there's a majority in favor of a ceasefire, that half of all Democrats say this is a genocide. Americans are saying that to pollsters, despite not even getting the full picture. Can you imagine what those numbers would look like if they actually saw what was happening on the ground?
Well, I want to go to what is unfolding right now in Gaza. You said in a recent interview that in the past, Israel was, quote, mowing the lawn, but now the Netanyahu government's intention is to erase the population of Gaza. So let's go to what Prime Minister Netanyahu said about the invasion of Rafah, saying it would go ahead and would last weeks, not months. He was speaking to Politico on Sunday.
We're not going to leave them. I have a red line. You know what the red line is? That October 7th doesn't happen again. Never happens again. And to do that, we have to complete the destruction of the Hamas terrorist army. We're very close to victory. It's close at hand. We've destroyed 3/4 of Hamas fighting terrorist battalions. And we're close to finishing the last part in Rafah, and we're not going to give it up. Once we begin the intense action of eradicating the Hamas terrorist battalions in Rafah, it's a matter of weeks and not months.
So, Mehdi, your response to what Netanyahu said and what the Israelis have proposed as a safe place for Gazans to go, namely humanitarian islands.
And out that territory altogether.
So number one, when you hear Netanyahu speak, doesn't it remind you of George Bush in kind of 2002, 2003? It's very, invoking 9/11 to justify every atrocity, claiming that you're trying to protect the country when you yourself, your idiocy and your incompetency is what led to the attack. George Bush was unable to prevent 9/11 and then used 9/11 to justify every atrocity, even though his incompetence helped allow 9/11 to happen. And I feel the same when Netanyahu allowed the worst terror attack, the worst massacre in Israel to happen on his watch. Many of his own, generals, many of his own people blame him for this. And so it's rich to hear him saying, my aim is to stop this from happening again. Well, you couldn't stop it happening the first time, and now you're killing innocent Palestinians under the pretense that this is national security. Number two, again, George Bush-like, claiming that the war is nearly done, mission is nearly accomplished. That's nonsense. No serious observer believes that Hamas is finished or that Israel has won some total victory. A member of Netanyahu's own war cabinet said recently, anyone who says you can absolutely defeat Hamas is telling tall tales, is lying. That was a colleague of Netanyahu's in government who said that. And number three, the red line on Rafah that Biden supposedly set down and that Netanyahu is now mocking, saying my own red line is to do the opposite. What on earth is Joe Biden doing in allowing Benjamin Netanyahu to humiliate him in this way with this invasion of Rafah, even after he said he opposes it? I mean, one thing thing to leak stuff over a few months.
Let's go to Biden. Speaking on MSNBC, he's being interviewed by your former colleague, Jonathan Capehart, as he was being questioned about Benjamin Netanyahu and saying